All right, thanks everybody for joining us. Welcome. Good evening. I'm Cynthia Pinto Cabrera with the Central Valley Air Quality Coalition. We'll go over some Zoom tech, interpretation, and then we can get started hearing from our wonderful panelists. And just to note that this webinar is being recorded. So by participating, you are consented to being recorded. Emilia, will you interpret?
Oh, yeah, of course, sorry. Sí, bienvenidos a todos, bienvenidos a este seminario web que vamos a tener de parte de la Coalición de Calidad del Aire del Valle Central. Vamos a repasar algunos controles sobre Zoom y también un recordatorio que este seminario se está grabando. Entonces, al participar, usted está dando su consentimiento para ser grabado.
Thank you. So for interpretation, there will be a little icon at the bottom of your screen. If you are on a computer, and you can go ahead and select a little globe icon and to select English or Spanish. If you are on a cell phone or a tablet, there'll be a 3-dot icon that indicates more, and you can select language interpretation there.
Esta junta tiene interpretación simultánea en el lenguaje de español. Para poder acceder a la interpretación, si usted está por computadora, buscará el icono de un mundo que aparece abajo de su pantalla, luego seleccionará español y los invitamos a poner en modo silencio el audio original. De esa manera no está escuchando dos voces. Si usted está por celular o por tableta, el proceso es diferente. Seleccionará los 3 puntitos que significa más, luego seleccionarán interpretación, luego seleccionará español, y una vez más poner en modo silencio el audio original. Cuando ha acabado, seleccionará listo o done y debería de estar escuchando en español.
Yeah, and just as our interpreter just mentioned that you will need to mute your original audio. So whether you're on your computer or cell phone or tablet, there's a little icon that says mute original audio. We will be taking questions and answers through our question and answer feature on Zoom, and that is on your computer will be a little Q&A icon with a little message picture on there on both your computer and your cell phone / tablet.
If we could turn on interpretation. Y antes de comenzar la interpretación, vamos a utilizar una función de preguntas y respuestas que también aparece abajo de su pantalla. Si usted está por computadora, se va a aparecer como unas burbujitas de habla. Lo va a seleccionar y ahí puede ingresar su pregunta en español y la vamos a traducir a inglés. Si usted está por celular, una vez más también va a buscar ese mismo icono y ahí puede escribir su pregunta.
We also do have the chat option available and open to everybody. If you have any questions or just have any any comments, you can go ahead and select the chat icon on your computer, cell phone, or tablet.
Will we be turning on interpretation now?
In a moment after this chat, after this slide.
Okay, great. Sorry, we're used to them normally going in and then we just simultaneously. Una vez más, también para poder participar a través del chat, va a buscar el icono de un chat que aparece por su computadora, también parece burbuja de habla y ahí va a poder empezar a chatear junto con todos. Si usted está por celular, una vez más va a buscar los 3 puntitos y seleccionará donde dice chatear o chat. Y si está por tableta, igual el proceso saldrá.
And we can go ahead and turn on interpretation right now. And I will pass it off to my colleague, Jasmine, to do a quick land acknowledgement.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. So today we want to formally and with great respect acknowledge that we are on the unceded traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of the Yokuts, Miwok, and Mono peoples. The treaties made by our federal government after the 1849 California Gold Rush and the Mariposa Indian War of 1850 were not honored, and we played an active role in their displacement. Indigenous peoples are still here and resilient to ongoing genocide, including this region's air pollution. Historically, environmental movements have not been an ally to Indigenous peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we recognize and continually support and advocate for the sovereignty of the Native nations in this territory and beyond. We also collectively recognize Indigenous peoples have critically important knowledge systems and practices that can advance environmental justice, and we commit to uplifting the vision of Indigenous leaders to build a sustainable future. And I'll pass it to Dr. Catherine Gruber-White.
Thank you so much, Jasmine, and good evening, everyone. My name is Catherine Gruber-White. I use they and she pronouns, and I'm the Executive Director for the Central Valley Air Quality Coalition, or CVAQ. On behalf of CVAQ and our co-sponsors this evening, welcome and thank you for joining us. I'm going to take just a second to pull up a slide deck and give us just a quick overview of the agenda this evening and a kickoff. So our sponsors this evening, Central Valley Air Quality Coalition, Little Manila Rising, and the Wilderness Society for the centrally important topic of wildfires, forest management, and climate change in the San Joaquin Valley. CVAQ and our partners are dedicated to addressing the unequal health impacts of air pollution, and forest management is an increasingly important and key component. I want to encourage tonight self and community care, recognizing what difficult times we continue to be under with the pandemic, and really appreciate and respect and honor everyone's time for joining us this evening. I particularly want to thank our speakers for being here with us, CVAQ staff, Jasmine and Cynthia, for all the work that they put into organizing this event, Matt Holmes with Little Manila Rising for all that he contributed, and all of you, the participants, for joining us this evening. So we're in the welcome and interview or overview section now, then we'll segue to our panelists. We'll have time for questions that you can submit using the Q&A feature. And then at the end, we'll take a few minutes to close with some calls to action. We also like to get to know a little bit about our participants. So we invite you to introduce yourself in the chat, name, pronouns, where you're joining from, and if you're affiliated with any type of organization. We also have a poll that I'm going to launch right now that it again is optional if you'd like to participate in that, so we can get a sense of who our audience is this evening. So please feel free to fill out the poll or introduce yourself. In the interest of time, I'm going to keep going with the overview presentation. So this map from the California Indian Library collections shows just some of the known diversity of Indigenous peoples in California whose true numbers and names were lost to settler colonialism. I personally teach California geography and find it essential to talk about the history of settler colonialism and the peoples that predated the landscape that we see around us today. And as Jasmine mentioned, that we acknowledge that wherever we're joining from today, we're on unceded tribal lands. While intense wildfires have caught people by surprise in recent years, they have always been a part of California's landscape, and Native Americans managed our environment using cultural burning practices. When Europeans arrived, they supplanted these practices with fire suppression. And so today we have denser vegetation that's fuel for fires. We have drought and extreme heat and interconnected factors like tree die-off from bark beetles that have worsened our existing conditions in our forests. Our fire season starts earlier, lasts longer, and is more intense. Some of the beautiful and iconic landscapes that I'm so lucky to have grown up around, like Yosemite, as you can see here, some of my personal photos have been threatened, and our air pollution has been horribly impacted by massive catastrophic wildfires like the Creek Fire pictured here. The top 20 largest wildfires have all occurred since 2000, and 9 of those just in the time period of 2020 to 2021 alone. 55% of Californians say the threat of wildfires is a big problem in their part of the state, and 30% say somewhat of a problem, according to a Public Policy Institute of California survey conducted in 2021. So our populations are incredibly concerned. Research shows that in the San Joaquin Valley, our ozone and particle pollution seasons are now occurring at the same time. And science doesn't fully understand the synergistic effects of being exposed to high levels of multiple pollutants at the same time. There are many important processes underway to address climate change and forest management, including a federal climate action plan for our forests and CARB's 2022 scoping plan that we'll hear more about later. It's also centrally important for us at CVAQ that we keep in mind that these risks are not distributed equally. There are 5 population groups that we tend to think of as being the most adversely impacted, and we have an expert to speak about health impacts in a moment. So I definitely won't give an exhaustive description, but just want to emphasize pregnant people, children who are under 18 because their lungs are still developing and really their entire systems. Elders who are over 65 are more vulnerable, anyone with pre-existing heart and lung conditions, and our populations like our farm laborers who are working outdoors and don't have the option of not going outside when the air is unhealthy. These are the top 5 populations that we consider most at risk for air pollution in the valley. And it's important to consider that that's roughly 50% of our population. So what can we do? We can protect ourselves and we can take action. And that's part of what we're here to discuss this evening. It's also part of CVAQ's role to be a resource to our communities in educating people on health impacts and ways that they can protect themselves. So right now we do have a page on our website where you can access this brochure and other information about how to protect your health. And in the coming months, we'll actually be launching a set of materials that is specific to how people can best protect themselves from wildfire smoke. So please do feel free to check out this resource and be in touch with us at CVAQ if there are ways that we can support you or provide presentations in the community. So with that, I want to thank you all. Again, this is the contact information for CVAQ. We've got a really great lineup of speakers. And so I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Dr. Irva Hertz-Picciotto with UC Davis.
Thank you very much. Do you need to stop sharing for me to share, or can I just go do I share? Okay.
Yes, you should be able to share now.
Okay. All right, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Irva Hertz-Picciotto. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a professor in the Department of Public Health Sciences at UC Davis, and I'm also the director of our Environmental Health Sciences Center. And I'm really excited to talk to you today about climate change, air pollution, wildfires, and human health. And you've already heard a little bit of an introduction on that, on those issues. And what do I do to advance? Okay. So just starting with air pollution sources, because wildfires are in fact just very high air pollution, but there are some differences as well. But air pollution really comes from multiple sources, and these 6 are really the primary ones. So car exhaust, traffic is a major contributor. A second major contributor is our power generation, which to the extent that we're using fossil fuels in particular, whether it's gas or coal or other related ways of generating energy, that would be one of our major contributors. There's also a contribution from agriculture, which produces nitrate particles and from the fertilizers, but also a fair amount of dust gets kicked up in the process of preparing fields. And then volcanoes, which I don't know if we have any in California actually, but this is a general slide, and probably did at some point in time. And then fires, which includes, residential fires, wildfires, agricultural burning, other kinds of intentional burning that produce black carbon and organic carbon and other kinds of particles. And then dust storms that when you have really incredibly high winds in areas with dry ground, then you can be filling the air with these very, very tiny particles. So air pollution is actually made up of particles and gases. And much of the research that's been done has actually been done really focused on the particles and not so much the gases, which can be a problem, but we have a ways to go. So research we don't know everything we need to know about air pollution. The size of particles is important. So there are particles known as PMs, which stands for particulate matter 10. And the PM10 are the coarser particles, the bigger particles. They're still very small. So a particle, which is represented here in the blue, actually is the 10 micrometer diameter, micrometer. Micron is sometimes the abbreviated word. And it's about the size of, it's about 1/6 the size of a human hair. If you took a diameter of a human hair, then that would be, and take 1/6 of that, that's the coarse PM10 particle. We tend to be more concerned, however, about the PM2.5, which are even smaller, about 1/4 the size of these. And those are the ones that go deep into the lung, into the small airways. So the coarser particles tend to be only in the larger airways. But what really matters is being able to expand your lungs from deep down. And that's the biggest problem, are the really fine particles. What about air pollution and health? How does it actually affect our health? Well, there are a lot of ways. So there's increases in chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which often happens in older people who have had a lot of exposures that might include things like smoking. Lower respiratory infections, which includes pneumonia and some types of flu, that leads to bronchitis. Problems during pregnancy, like low birth weight in the baby due to air pollution. Stroke, which is when not enough blood makes it to the brain and can be fatal. Same with heart disease, where the blood that actually flows to the heart itself for the pump and the muscle of the heart to work, and heart attacks and lung cancer. So there are a lot of ways in which air pollution can affect our health. This is the trajectory of climate change since 1880s. And you can see that the middle line is kind of an arbitrary one because it's just kind of an average. But you can see that the temperatures were much cooler in the late 20th century, late 19th century, and the beginning of the 20th century. And then we've started to see this rise, which really began around 1980, that has gone rapidly up and is continuing to go up, and even at an increasing pace. So it's getting very steep, this rise, and we can expect it to continue as we continue to pollute the upper atmosphere with these greenhouse gas emissions, which includes carbon dioxide, methane, and several other like nitrous oxide. So this is where we are. And, at 2020 here, and I guess the 2021 data aren't yet on this graph. Oh no, maybe that's the last one. So we are trying to keep this climate change to slow it down. And of course, there's a lot of activity, and we're trying to get our governments to pay attention as well. But this is sort of where we are, and this is what has fueled our fires. Sorry, how do I do this? Okay. Just briefly about how climate change relates then to air pollution is that the greenhouse gas emissions warm the planet. They cause a lot of effects, including extreme weather events, altered rainfall patterns, meaning that some areas are getting way more water than they used to, and some are getting way less, leading to droughts, floods, heat waves from the temperature, and wildfires. And then the fires themselves increase the particulates in the air. there's increases in ozone as well as pollen and allergenic particles in the air. And then these can all lead to different health effects that, as I talked about, it could be cardiovascular or respiratory, but there are other effects. There's effects on mental health from the stresses. Undernutrition can happen when our food systems start to break down, and agriculture is affected, and vector-borne diseases can change as well and become more prevalent. And then there are many, many factors that can exacerbate all of these effects that are listed here on the right-hand side, like poverty, mass migration, loss of homes, displacement, and then political conflicts, of course. And then this is all against the backdrop of the social determinants of health. So fires produce extremely high levels of particles. This photo was taken at noon in 2018 as the fire in Paradise, California, the fire known as the Camp Fire, was in its early phase. There are, because wildfires are in fact extreme conditions of air pollution, we can expect that whatever we see from air pollution is going to happen also with wildfires. So in fact, the data show that there are hospitalizations and emergency department visits that increased by extreme amounts every time we have these fires. The data on whether heart disease increases is a little bit mixed, and I think better studies need to be done, paying attention to also the time periods. What hasn't been studied very much are the long-term studies, and because of that, we began with a new study called What Now, California, which stands for Wildfires and Health, Assessing the Toll. And we originally thought we would be primarily in Northern California, so What Now, California. We are collecting data directly from communities, regardless of healthcare utilization. Obviously, hospitalizations and ED visits are only the tip of the iceberg of health effects. And so this was one of our early studies from 2017, where we saw how and this was a survey of, we had about 2,000 households, which comprised about 5,000 or more people. And we saw that wheezing and asthma was more than 20% at that point in time. Typically, asthma and wheezing affects somewhere around 10 to 12 or maybe even 15%, but in some communities. But this was extremely high, at over 20%. We also saw that these more minor symptoms were extremely prevalent. Almost 50% of people with cough, and same with irritated eyes, and more than 50% who had at least one of these minor symptoms, not even counting the major symptoms. So really the majority of the population is affected by the respiratory effects, respiratory symptoms that come with wildfires. Then when we looked at who was most vulnerable, we saw that this is not evenly distributed in the population. And in fact, the highest risk was for people with prior asthma, which I guess is not surprising, but it was a pretty extreme increase because they already, have these asthmatic symptoms, and those increased threefold, the symptoms that they were experiencing. Also, people who had significant damage to their home, but it wasn't completely destroyed. I think the ones that were completely destroyed were really much more, had evacuated and really gone further away, perhaps. But anyway, those had 60% higher risk. Children younger than 5 years or older than 35 had higher levels of symptoms, and so did females, and so did these are sort of non-white. The Asians looked a lot more like the whites, so they were in the referent group that we were comparing to, and these groups as a whole had much more much more wheezing and asthma. And also those who are at the high end of the exposures when we looked at air monitors of PM 2.5. And all of these effects were independent of the others. And so we had adjusted for age and sex and all of these other factors that are listed at the bottom of the slide here when we did this analysis. And this is just showing you some of the differences. So these are the people with prior asthma diagnosis. And you can see that the effect of the PM 2.5 is seen at the upper end here. We can see that the youngest children, 0 to 5, were particularly at high risk, and that everyone over 35 also was at higher risk with the highest group seemed to be 35 to 49-year-olds. It may be that as people get older, they're spending more time indoors and therefore doing more to protect themselves. And people in their middle years are still outside a lot more. And working, particularly outdoor workers. And then this is the racial ethnic difference here. And this is those without prior asthma. And you can see some of the same patterns, although the age pattern was a little bit more extreme. And again, some racial differences. And this is showing, oops, they're not lined up right, but this is the males and this is the females. So the vertical line is the comparison group, and the comparison groups are the ones that have just the dots and don't have the bars around them. I should have said that at the beginning. The third group we looked at were children without a prior asthma diagnosis. These were adults. And here's where you can really see the 0 to 5 were at the highest risk. 6 to 12 were also at higher risk compared to the teenagers. Again, females, and in this case, the low socioeconomic groups were also at higher risk. So the conclusions, it's really obvious that respiratory problems do increase with wildfires as expected. More than 50% of the population experience symptoms. And these are those vulnerable groups I just mentioned. There's another note I want to make, which is that a study that was done in non-human primates. So there's a big colony of monkeys that is used for research, and they were exposed because they are actually housed out in the outdoors. They were exposed to smoke during one of these earlier wildfire seasons in 2008, where the plume came through Davis. And when they studied them as they aged, they were just barely born. They were very young when the fires happened. And they experienced reduced lung growth, as well as changes in their immune system and in the blood markers. And both of those were observed all the way into adulthood as these monkeys aged. They're now adults. So some of our next steps for the What Now study are that we recognize now that the plumes travel enormous distances. So we were focused in Northern California, but it's quite clear that the plumes go much further than we had actually ever expected. And that this is an area we'd really like to expand our population and work with community groups to let them know about the research that they can participate in. We also think that there will be longer term effects that need to be looked at. How long for someone who's vulnerable does that cough last? And there were open-ended questions in this survey where people were saying that that whole winter after the fires, that are generally in the fall, that people in their family were having more colds than usual, more respiratory problems, people who didn't seem to get over it very quickly. So that's an important area, because the traditional wisdom, oops, sorry, let me go back. The sort of traditional wisdom in the medical field is that, yeah, it's a high exposure, but it's transient, and your symptoms will go away, once the fire and the smoke clears up. But that does not, from our survey, does not appear to be necessarily the case. To add to the analyses of PM 2.5, there's a lot of other components of air pollution, and we and others have been trying to understand more about the other components. Some of the ones that have maybe never even been measured because we didn't have quite such large fires going into residential areas. These larger fires are also hotter, so they burn things in a different way, and there's more new chemicals that are being produced by combustion. We also want to look at these cumulative exposures over multiple years. That wasn't just a one-time thing. We're seeing that the fires are getting worse, and the data that the first speaker, I think I've forgotten your name already, but that you pointed out that the biggest ones were in the 2020 to 2021 years. Really, we've got a different situation, and we need to understand what happens with these multiple exposures, multiple years. And then I just want to say very quickly that there's been some studies looking at whether wildfires exacerbate. There's only been one looking at whether wildfires might exacerbate COVID symptoms. But there have been several that looked at higher air pollution, historical air pollution, people who've lived in areas with high air pollution, which would include certainly many parts of the Central Valley. That seems to be a susceptibility factor for COVID, more frequent cases of COVID, and also more severe symptoms in people who have that history. But climate change actually also has other aspects that may intertwine with the effects of wildfires, and that would include extreme high temperatures, which can lead to dehydration and kidney failure, neurologic decline, and worse. And then the heat and the high winds may play a role in spreading various infectious agents like bacteria and viruses and fungi, like valley fever, in fact. And then we have issues with drought. Of course, there are areas, communities that where their wells have gone dry, and we've had several years where the government was having to truck in water, and so all of these factors are compounding each other. And then we have downstream impacts from the numbers of people who have been displaced because they've lost their homes, and certainly mental health is a big issue in those populations. So all around the world, we're seeing these floods, these drought, fires, and then melting of the ice caps that is predicted to be resulting in the rise of sea level to the point that it is going to threaten coastal communities as well. So besides climate change, we really need to think about all the other things that we're doing to the planet. And the bottom three here are all specifically climate change, but then there are other factors that are really interacting with the problems created by climate change and increasing greenhouse gas emissions from population, deforestation and changing land use, and other problems. I have some slides now about how to protect yourself. And some of these actually were mentioned by the CVAQ spokesperson. So I'll just really.
Dr. Irva Hertz-Picciotto?
Yeah.
I think, well, this is a lot of good information, and we did get a chance to cover some of this, but we do need to move on to our next speaker.
So let me just show you my next. Yeah, so these have been talked about already. And working outdoors, you do have some legal rights. And then besides adaptation, these are things that communities can do, that you can do individually, that you can work towards with other community organizations, and things that you can do to change things in your own communities. And I will be quiet now, let you go on.
Yeah, thank you. And we can always return to them in the Q&A section as well.
Great.
So
yeah, sorry.
Are you jumping back on, Catherine? Or next up, I can introduce. So next up is Chief David Shay with the CAL FIRE Tulare Unit and Division Chief of Pre-Fire Fuels Management and Resource Management.
Good evening, everyone. All right. Apologize here. All right. Good evening. Again, my name is Dave Shay. I'm Division Chief, Registered Professional Forester for CAL FIRE. So what we're going to do is talk about why are there so many large fires, and kind of how did we get there? Landscapes in California are historically very fire adapted, and fire is a very natural process here in California. So during the pre-settlement, fires typically came through ponderosa stand, every 5 to 12 years. And then the grass oak woodlands, you typically have fire about every 10 years would come through. The fire intensity of these fires was generally low to moderate. Fire would kind of burn through and just kind of burn the understory. It would any of the limbs or stuff that would fallen out of the trees, they would be consumed. Any of the competing brush would typically be removed, and just kept everything almost, as you will, like a park-like setting. And that was fairly common up until the early 1900s. And so then the post-settlement areas and kind of where we're at now, you take that same, what used to be a ponderosa stand, is now the fire return interval is about 192 years. And then the oak woodlands, we have a return interval now of about 78 years. Typically now when we get these fires, they're high to very high intensity. These are kind of what we classify as a stand replacement, because they burn so hot. They're killing pretty much everything that's in there. They're killing the trees, they're killing everything on there. And that's basically because of the fuel loading and stuff from years that have been going on with fire suppression and the lack of having that natural fire come through the area. So basically what had happened in 1910, it was a terrible year for fires, especially in the Pacific Northwest. There was about 3 million acres that had burned during that summer. That was enough timber was killed to make a train that's 2,400 miles long filled with timber. Basically, there was 8 billion board feet, or enough homes or enough wood to build 800,000 houses. 20 million acres had burned in the Pacific Northwest, and entire towns were destroyed. So this pretty much kind of started the whole thing with fire and how it's used. It became, fire is kind of thought of as being bad. Land managers, ranchers who typically would light fires towards the end of the fall as they were coming out of the upper slopes, would light fires and create that understory burn that would prep everything for the next year's harvest and kind of stuff like that. That was deemed kind of irresponsible, and that started a kind of a campaign of all fire will be suppressed. So that lasted up until about 1945. And then there was kind of a shift back into, hey, look, we need to start using fire again as a management tool, especially in the ranching community. It was identified that a lot of these ranches and rangelands that used to have grass is being encroached on by all the brush and stuff like that. So there was kind of a philosophy of bringing all the fire back in and kind of doing what the Native Americans had always done, and also the early Americans, to reduce that competing vegetation. That lasted up until about 1955, where it kind of peaked with about 200,000 acres was being burned every year. So then we moved into logging to the 70s. Then we had several decades of the environmentalists and communities kind of putting pressure on the resource side of things and reducing all the logging that was being done for building all the houses and all the wood that we use. Well, logging was very beneficial in a way because it helped reduce the fuel loading in these forests. It kept them managed. And so when reducing all this, the logging allowed these forests to continue to overpopulate. So by the early 2000s, almost the majority of the logging in the state was gone. It's limited to the major landowners and timber companies. A majority of the logging has been halted or severely reduced, like in the federal forests. And now the small ranchers, the small landowners that used to do logging, all that kind of stuff is gone. A majority of the sawmills in California are gone. And this is just kind of continuing to what's going on. So as we move forward to 2015, obviously that became a pretty bad year. The state had several years of drought conditions. The forests in the Central Sierras had pretty much hit the perfect storm. So this came from basically from the years of forest being unmanaged, and it allowed the change in species composition, if you will. So instead of just having these fire tolerant species like the ponderosa pine, then you started getting other species that would come in and help overcrowd the stands. So as the stands got overcrowded, that put stress on the trees. And then you add the years of drought on top of that, which added more stress to the trees. Then you have the natural attack by the insects that are naturally, they occur all the time, but typically a healthy tree can protect itself. It'll sap the insect out through its the sap and stuff like that, and protect its tree. But that wasn't been happening because the defense mechanism of these trees was completely compromised. And then you had the life cycle of the bark beetle, for example. Instead of having one, maybe two life cycles in a season, we were having 3 to 4 life cycles that year. And then as it went from 2015 into 2016, it never really got cold enough to terminate the life cycle. And the life cycle in these trees continue to occur throughout the year. And then basically almost 100% mortality, for example, in the ponderosa pine at certain elevations here in the Sierra Nevadas. Again, the fire dependent forests are typically stands that are very resistant to fire or adapted to fire. They like the fire. If you look at a ponderosa pine stand, and I keep bringing back the ponderosa pine because that's the easiest one to identify and kind of see what I'm talking about. If you look at a ponderosa pine, it typically has a very high canopy. So the bottom 25 to 50 feet of that tree, there are no limbs because they're naturally prune themselves. And it allows that way when a fire comes through, there's no ladder fuel or anything to carry that fire up into the canopy. The bark on these trees is extremely thick and acts as an insulator to help protect it from the fire as it comes through. And then as it's also adapted because the cones, when it goes to reproduce, it's going to want to have not only a nice clean seed bed on the ground that is achieved from having a fire go through, but it's also opening up the cones and allowing the seeds from those cones to drop down. And there's very little competition for those new seeds to kind of produce. And so that kind of goes through, and then it allows that stand to produce. And then in a couple, 5-10 years, typically you'd have a fire that would come through, thin out some of those younger trees and, kill some of them, but it also space them out appropriately. And then they would start producing these same characteristics. And then what we have now are these very fire intolerant species. And we get these stands that are very intolerant of fire because we've had decades of fire suppression, because like I said, all fire was bad and all fires had to be put out as soon as they could. That was kind of the philosophy that we've had for generations, for decades. And when it allows to happen is that we're getting these other species that are very fire shade tolerant species, kind of, for example, like your firs and stuff like that, who like to have shade. They like to have that competition. They like to grow in very close quarters. But then you start looking at that, they have the fire characteristics that I had just mentioned on the ponderosa are kind of the exact opposite of what these trees are. They have limbs that go all the way down to the ground. And that allows even a small fire to get up into those limbs and act as that ladder fuel, get it up into the canopy and destroy the whole tree. You have these thick stands of all this dead material from all the different limbs and trees that have grown up in there and fallen, has all accumulated on the ground. You have all the brush that's coming in there. So these forests, what used to be like parklight, are completely choked out with all this biomass because it hasn't been managed naturally through the fire, hasn't been managed through other mimicking characteristics like logging and stuff like that. So then when you do get these fires that are in here, even a small little lightning fire that would typically be just a small little fire, it would do a nice little understory cleanup, is going to gradually increase so much heat and energy as it starts burning all this fuel, and it's going to run up into the canopy. And that's really one of the biggest issues that we're facing. And so now you have all that, and now the other thing that's taken place is all the forests used to be kind of separate. They were out there, not a whole lot of people would just go there to kind of visit. Now we have a huge amount of the population is living inside the forest. They moved up there because it's a beautiful place and they want to be in that setting. But by that happening, that creates a lot of other unintended consequences. Now we have increased amount of population that are in there. It makes it harder to defend these forests. Fire is not, or any type of fuel treatments aren't really allowed to be done in there because they don't want to do it in their backyards. They don't want to thin out the trees. That's why they moved to those places, because they had trees. And then you have the increase of, just because of the population in there, you're going to have the increase on ignitions. More vehicles in the area are going to cause more vehicle type accident. People that are up there working on their fences, grinding, welding, or have the likelihood of causing more accidental fire. But then you also have obviously the arsonists and all that stuff, because it's easy for them to get in and out of those areas, because someone going down that street no one's going to think twice about seeing someone up there. Whereas, 50 years ago, you saw someone driving down a dirt road. The locals would kind of, question them a little bit more. So that kind of leads into the staffing. So you take a fire that was, that said we had 50 years ago, you had a 100-acre fire in a ponderosa pine type stand. You're going to have, it is something we could have probably done with a handful of engines and a crew, because they can get in there, work safely, and kind of corral that. They'd be able to set up a perimeter and kind of attack the fire safely. But you take that same stand now, now you have not only the increase of fire behavior, the intensity and the heat and all that's generated, but then you have the complexity of the public that's now in there. So if you have a fire that's coming towards a house, we're almost going to have to put a single engine to protect that house as the fire comes towards that house. Whereas before, we'd be able to have a fire engine could protect, maybe up to a quarter mile of perimeter, if you will, trying to be able to defend that. Now they're confined to having to stay there and protect that almost single house as that fire front moves through. So and then as you increase the number of houses in that area, you can see how this compounds rapidly. And you can kind of seeing that as it's occurring now, when you see these fire camps and you see, a huge amount of fire resources, and you're wondering why that is. Well, it's because of the complexity of these fires, not just because of the fire itself, but because of all the issues we have with the public and the other infrastructure and all that stuff that also has to be protected as we move through there.
Yeah. Chief, can you go ahead and wrap us up with this
Okay.
last slide so we can pass over to Ron?
All right. And then, so some of the things we're implementing is some prescribed fire. Sorry. And then basically, we're just using some different fuels reduction methods to get in there to clean up and help creating some of these fuel breaks and stuff like that. By hand, by mechanical. And then here's kind of I'll leave it at this, it's kind of a picture from, the 1900s, the same mountain. And you can see the difference in the vegetation type and how much denser it is over the last 90 years. And with that, I'll go ahead and end it. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, if you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A, either for Chief Shay or our previous speaker. And next up, we have Ron Goode, who is the tribal chairman of the North Fork Mono Tribe, and I'll pass it to him. So Ron, feel free to share your presentation.
Am I unmuted?
The tree's talking to it.
Can you see it?
Yeah.
Yeah, we hear you and the screen is up.
I can't see it.
Huh? We're no, we're okay. We're good. We're good. We put topsoil in that ash dissolves that. When we're all done, then we move that ash back out, mixing it with our soil. We shouldn't have black spots. We shouldn't have white spots. It should be nice and dark.
Ron, are you able to pull up the presentation?
I hear it. I don't see it.
Also,
Yeah,
good.
so it looks like there's a little icon on your desktop where the video is playing, but all we can see is the little thumbnail. If there's a way to make that video full screen.
Well, that's what we was trying to do.
Okay, yeah, we see it bigger now.
The tree's talking to it. Yeah.
We don't have the audio on the video though, so just as a heads up.
I can hear it.
Yeah, I can.
No, we're
see
okay.
that.
We're good. We're good. We put topsoil in it.
Now you still don't hear it?
Dissolves that.
No, we hear it. We're
Tree's
good.
talking to it.
Can you hear it now?
Yeah.
Yes.
We're no, we're okay. We're good. We're good. We put topsoil in it. And that ash dissolves that. When we're all done, then we move that ash back out, mixing it with our soil. We shouldn't have black spots. We shouldn't have white spots. It should be nice and dark. Essentially, what we are doing is we're creating hidden is from these people that lived here for, as my artifacts say, 8,000 years and probably longer.
Well, can't stop it. That's the problem. All right, stop video.
It's not really.
No, but it won't quit showing. No,
Talk over it.
no, because I got another program to do. Okay, there we go. Now it went out. Hang on, wherever you are. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Okay. PowerPoint, if it'll come up. Okay, can you see it?
Yes. Yep, it's all good.
Okay. So, good morning or afternoon, evening. Enjoyed the two talks. So we've been doing a lot of restoration work. We've been doing cultural burning for decades in and around the Central Valley here, foothills, mountains, forests, parks, tribal lands, private lands. And so we've also been doing a lot of restoration work with meadows in the same kind of manner. One of the photos that Chief Shay was sharing was showing the early pictures of the timber, and that's when the Native American was living on the land. We had what we call a see-through concept, and when you looked into that picture, you could see out for maybe 100 yards through the forest, and that's the way it's supposed to be. Unlike the final pictures, in where he was showing you, you know, how thick it was, and you couldn't even see any part of the mountain in itself. One of the things, though, with cultural burning and cultural fire, and we're dealing with Native Americans, is the spirituality. We recognize the spirits of the land. We recognize the fact that everything on the land has a relationship to us, and that we have an interconnection to it, and that we are interconnected in many different ways. Here I'm showing the Manzanita trunk, and you see the curly bark that's on it, and over, where's my arrow? Okay, over by the house there, oops, there's poison oak. So if you caught poison oak, then you would use the bark on this tree to take care of it. This tree supplies a whole lot of different items for our culture and our people. So in our language, Apaso Wabi, my friend, my cousin. The elderberry is very interesting as well. Here we are in the midst of a pandemic, and a lot of the scientists have, from day one, said elderberry doesn't have anything to do with the virus, and yet all of us, and those of us that have been using it, still swear by it. But it's very interesting in our culture that we have named the elderberry, about grandpa and elder woman. And these terms, when you look back 4,000 years into European culture, that's where the word elderberry came from as well. And we too looked at it in the same manner. The red bud is very beautiful, but at this point, this red bud is not very useful. So it's no longer a resource other than to look good. So we burn it. We bring in folks from all over California. We have people who fly in from other states to come and join us. Our next two burns are going to be in February and March. We just completed a burn this past weekend with Cal Fire and state parks, and we got 4 good burns going for them to demonstrate to them what cultural burning is all about. We hold training classes and programs throughout the year. Back in December, we had UC Berkeley there. So Davis, Berkeley, Fresno State, a number of these will all be coming to attend our next burn in February. It's putting fire on the land. When we burn, the whole point of burning is not to destroy the root system. And when we burn, the whole point of our burning is to have a return, and an immediate return. And so that return is going to give us freshness and going to allow us to hold water and moisture on the soil in the plants. After we burn, this is the kind of recovery we have, and these are red buds used by our basket makers. And in this past weekend, we just went through about 6 or 7 bushes just like this, because they've outgrown themselves from 2018. So 4 years later, we're having to redo them. You can see one of my basket makers has a nice bundle of sticks. This weekend, there were several of those bundles of sticks. And our elders gathering. The whole point of cultural burning is to sustain our culture. And a part of that sustainability is to continue making our baskets and keeping our basket makers going, youth as well as elders. What to look at when our resource has finally come to an end, and this of course would be a super high fuel for wildfire. So we burn it. And when we're done, this is what it needs to look like. You don't see it completely scorched. You don't see white ash after you do when you see prescribed fire burns, because we're creating a nutrient. And that nutrient, within a matter of 1 to 2 months, is going to bring back medicines, going to bring back flowers, going to bring back the resources. We're putting smoke on the land. The smoke is very essential. It helps the trees, that we have a lot of parasites, a lot of mistletoe, even lichen is killing these trees. When the Native American lived on the land, they cleared it and kept it clear, just like you're looking at. In this particular site, we're in a village area in Mariposa, and we have about 40, 50 acres of a site, some 36 different features, probably up to 600 people once lived there. We always have medicines that come back, tobacco. We have berries that we use along with the sticks for basketry. We also get some invasives. Have to take care of them. Burning our pastures, getting rid of the tarweed and star thistle. We burn it down. And then one of the things about our fires and our smoke is that you're not going to get it down in the valley. It's all about the water. Whenever you burn, the water will rise. These kind of things are in our stories, our creation stories. It talks about when the Noom take their fires off the land, the water will rise. And that's exactly what happens when we burn. Let me know how I'm doing on time. So looking at cultural burning, prescribed fire, there are several different types of burning, broadcast burning, different intensities. A lot of pile burning by prescribed fire people. We are always laughing at our CAL FIRE people and at our forestry people and parks people because they want to build piles as large as a house. When we burn, we don't build piles larger than a beaver hut. The idea is to keep your fire small and take care of what you're supposed to be burning. And again, cultural burning is about the culture of the Native people, the traditionalists and traditional way of life. Many different kinds of resources. Native Americans, when they lived out on the land, and even now we have over 200 different resources and 95 different foods, medicines of all types. In our cultural burning, we do have piles, and we clean the trees, making sure that anything dead limbs are in there. We'll climb the trees if we have to, trim the trees so that they can have a new life, a renewal of life, resource restoration, plant, tree rejuvenation. It improves the capacity to hold water to the surface. When you've burned and when you've been working the land, the regrowth period is 0 to 6 years full growth is 6 to 8 years, and aging, we'll put an extra E in there, is 8 to 15 years. And so that's when you know that you needed to apply fire. And Chief Shay had a little bit of that in his report, which was pretty much right on. So you need to get time for to get a second burn and sometimes a third. Oh, keep going. Oh, maybe at the end. Again, cultural burning is not intended to stop a wildfire. It creates a place or space to control a burn and become a defensible landscape. We saw that with the Creek Fire, where Southern California Edison had been burning, and it became a good defensible landscape. Restoring resources for cultural traditions, food sovereignty, healthy nutritional native food, healthy cultural resources for basket makers, medicine plants for humans, animals, and insects. Every animal, every insect needs medicine. They can't go to the pharmacy to get their medicine. How climate change is affecting the use of fire. Very unpredictable. We at one time we were able to tell you what month we could burn in and what month, what days of the week we could burn. Now you have no idea. Your phone and your weather patterns will tell you, oh yeah, we're good for 10 days. And the next thing you know, you got, storms coming, and on the other hand, nothing for a couple of months. So it is pretty tough, as our first presenter talked about. We did, for the first time, we burned this year in the fall, in November. And that's probably the first time in 20 years that we've been able to burn in the fall time. And then we also burned in January. So again, we haven't done that for quite a spell.
Yeah, Chairman, you have about 2 more minutes for
I think
wrapping
I'm
up.
done.
Oh, okay, perfect.
Let me see. Yep, I think so.
Great. Yeah. Thank you again for this presentation. And we'll be moving on to our final speaker, who is Ashley Conrad-Saydah, founder of Sowing Change Strategies, Tahoe Regional Planning Agency board member, and UC Berkeley, California, China Climate Institute research affiliate.
Thank you so much. Thanks to our host and staff for putting this together today. It's really nice to be with you. Let's see, Jasmine, can you see just my slide and not the additional pieces around it? Or can you see all the pieces around it?
We can see all the pieces now.
Okay, so let me go into, hold on, let me just do slideshow then. There we go. Okay, so all of these opening presentations were really perfect for setting us up for talking about some solutions. First, we have heard that wildfires, and we know this, wildfires test community cohesion, they test ecosystem resilience. And as we heard from Ron Goode, the Native people in California know how to live in such a way where their communities stay together and actually can use fire in a way that they increase their cultural traditions. So we do know how to actually make sure that we can stay united and work together with fire on the landscape. Ecosystem resilience is a really big deal for California. We have 100 million acres. We are one of 33 biodiversity hotspots in the world. We have what that means is we have more endemic species and a different variety of species than many other places in the world. And those species are actually at great risk from climate change, drought, development, which is incredibly important, and a lot of other impacts that we're facing here. So wildfires are not just from a smoke perspective, but from all of these other sort of community collapse perspective, very challenging. The thing here, though, is that there's a difference between severe wildfires. We've seen about 3 million acres of severe wildfire over the last 5 years. And natural fire or fire that fire adapted communities and forests like us need. And as we've heard, a 7 to 10 year burn return interval is about right for our forests. So low level fires every 7 to 10 years where we can contain them are essentially what we're trying to get to. And of course, in the age of climate change and drought and development, expanded development into wildlands, it's very, very challenging to allow fires to burn. So this, Smokey the Bear and a tendency to believe that every fire needs to be put dead out that Dave Shay talked about earlier, that's really caused somewhat of a problem in that communities see fire and think immediately it needs to be put out, but occasionally it should be burned. And as we've seen with native practices, we should be doing these low level burns significantly more often than we're doing right now. And we should be funding those and expecting them. So while we don't want to exacerbate downstream health impacts, having low level smoke throughout the year is likely better for us, and I'm not a health specialist, but we should study this, would be better for us than 3 to 4 months of being stuck inside and unable to go outside with the types of air that's choking air. And we're clearly seeing that expand from 3 to 4 months to up to 6 months. I think we all remember painfully August of 2020 when we had extreme heat waves, power shutoffs, massive wildfires, and COVID all at the same time. And that was just, I think, crushing for everyone across the state and something that we don't want to confront again. So, urban and rural communities together both absorb these impacts. This is not an issue solely for communities where the fires sit. These are issues for communities downstream as well. And obviously that's why we're talking about this today. But it's really important to remember that we all bear a responsibility for shifting from our current conditions, for taking steps to change our relationship with nature, to change our relationship and expectations with nature, and to think about our own behaviors and the behaviors we can influence to change the types of practices that we see on the landscape. So proactive forest management is what we're talking about. That includes extensive planning, collaboration, lots of meetings, and lots of funding. And we're moving in that direction. Right now, the state has $1.5 billion just in the last year appropriated for this type of action. And that's in addition to hundreds of millions of dollars over the last several years. The most recent budget just proposed another $1.2 billion for wildfire and fuel reductions and forest management. Additionally, the Biden administration just announced, I think 2 days ago, $50 billion for West-wide forest health management. So there's abundant funding at this point proposed or appropriated. To be fair, it's a drop in the bucket for the actual costs. So there's data that shows that the costs of wildfires in 2020 alone were $50 billion. And that's not only the cost of the wildfire management and the response, but also all of the downstream impacts, the homes lost, the air quality impacts, the long-term water impacts. So when you think about the cost of those fires in 1 year at $50 billion, we really need to shift to proactive forest management and addressing these concerns before they can build into these massive conflagrations. And what that means is we actually need more local collaborative groups getting together and asking for the types of forest health projects that we have the funding for now. So groups like all of you who are on this call, others around the state, getting together and identifying your collective values. What is it that you're trying to accomplish in encouraging forest health treatments upstream? You're trying to accomplish community cohesion. We've talked about better air quality so that your kids can go outside and play every day. Water quality so that when you turn on the taps, water will be there, and silt from wildfires will not be filling in your reservoirs or causing so much need for more filtration and more dredging that your water costs skyrocket. These are the types of things where these upstream wildfires have true impacts on the day-to-day lives of people all over California and all over the West. So getting together and learning about these things exactly as we are right now, and then articulating what you'd like to see from forest health management is really, really important. And unfortunately, collaborative capacity, or the ability for collaboratives to get together and come up with durable decisions, ones that can be implemented on the ground, that's very limited in California. The Department of Conservation has a program called the Regional Forest and Fire Capacity Program that is actively funding that collaborative capacity building. And that capacity building, facilitation, helping groups get together, that can extend anywhere. I've encouraged them to also fund people. So it's not just, hiring a facilitator and meeting space, but to actually help pay people to go to those facilitated meetings. And that's something they're considering as well. But thinking about getting together as a collaborative to come up with those decisions for upstream management is incredibly important and will allow decisions to be made faster so that more of these projects can get on the ground. It takes a really, really long time to develop forest health projects. And in the time that we're developing them, we're just seeing, up to 10 million acres a year already burning. So, and again, that's not all high severity. We do want a lot of acres burning. We just want to be more knowledgeable and more strategic about where we're putting in treatments and where they're burning. So, and I should say, this is a picture of prescribed fire, right? So this is a picture of some thinning that happened first, some work that was done in the forest before fire was introduced as a way to try to reduce some of the fuel load, to increase the health of this forest, as Ron Goode was just talking about, to add nutrients back into the soil and to allow for more water absorption capacity in the soil. So again, we need to adapt way more rapidly than we are adapting right now in terms of policy and our responses. Climate change is pushing us. We're seeing unprecedented impacts on an annual basis, almost on a monthly basis. And this past October, we had an atmospheric rain event that basically ended our fire season. And that's why we were able to do prescribed burns in November, December, and January, which is amazing. Being able to do these prescribed burns now when we have wetter conditions is really, really critical. And the more we can get on the ground now, the better. What that does mean, though, is that we will deal with smoke in more months of the year if we can actually get more of these burns on the ground. So here's an example, as I was talking about, with ample funding of kind of where we are. So we have lots of funded actions. There's forest and watershed health projects coming from at least 3 different sources: home hardening and fire prevention programs, disaster relief, that's after the fire has burned through, some technical assistance. As I mentioned, the Department of Conservation and the Air Board are really providing technical assistance and capacity building support. And then wildfire suppression. So we're spending, as I mentioned, billions of dollars, significantly more than we're spending in proactive response on suppressing wildfires. And that's coming from CAL FIRE, Office of Emergency Services, Department of Interior, all of their departments, U.S. Forest Service, and the California Office of Emergency Services. And mind you, I'm not saying that we should not be suppressing fires, just that if we can do our jobs well, we will ultimately be able to shift more of those resources to pre-fire activity so that we have more natural burns and not highly severe burns that get out of control, where we lose lots of structures and we actually lose life. So underfunded actions, and this is this proactive local community engagement and planning, getting together exactly as you are, and more folks getting together more often to identify areas of need and identify values to be protected over time. Sustainable economic development. So, and this kind of couples with the next one, nature-based circular economy research. There's an opportunity for us to use some of the residue on the landscape. If we do selective thinning and selective logging, some of that residue could be turned into products like biochar, firewood, dowels, kind of smaller diameter products that actually would keep resources in some of these rural communities and Central Valley communities as well. So converting some of this feedstock that is overburdening our landscapes right now could actually allow for some economic prosperity in these communities. A lot of the communities that need economic diversity are being impacted and drained of populations as fires come through. We also need direct support for local NGOs and tribes to participate in some of these meetings, so directly funding these organizations. We need, again, proactive land use interventions. So even if a forest is healthy or appears healthy, getting in and doing as many interventions as possible so that when a fire burns through, there's an opportunity for it to burn at a low level. And then comparing these wildfire cost burdens, right? Do we accept the idea that we're losing $50 billion a year from fires, but spending, even at 2.7 billion, that would be significantly more than we've ever spent before, and yet it's still a drop in the bucket. And the goal is 1 million acres of proactive forest management a year, but we have 33 million acres of forest in California. So we may actually want to increase that already ambitious number to get to more treatment acres. We also could use geographic block grants. So this idea that, you know, there are collaboratives in place who know what they're doing, and sending out geographic block grants to put these interventions on the landscape that we know have benefits, even if we don't know the magnitude of those benefits, we need more of those out. And then we also need accessible spatial planning tools. Having a conversation in a vacuum without being able to see, you know, in front of you on a screen or on a, you know, on a visual in a meeting room, where you can actually zoom into the forests and look at the tree level, look at those different resource assets that you're really interested in, and figure out where you could put those treatments on the landscape. Having a conversation all together, where even if you might disagree about the types of treatments, but you can see the same thing. We need a lot of those as well. And all of these are being developed, which is great. So these underfunded or unfunded actions are all in discussion right now. And I think the more you all can think about these things and where you'd like to see some of these resources put would be incredibly helpful. And now is a good time. The budget's out. There's an opportunity to debate some of these questions in the legislature, and hopefully see, again, a lot of this funding getting out the door faster than it currently is. So, just these are some proactive forest management projects, right? Involve, if you actually have proactive forest management, you have interdisciplinary cross-sector collaboration, right? You have economists, scientists, cultural resource specialists all together. You have a lot of fine-scale spatial data, and you basically engage all of these different elements to end up with an increase in the pace and scale of forest restoration. So this is an example of one project that was funded a couple of years ago, and it's the Community and Watershed Resilience Program. It's the result of a national resilience competition that came into the last few years of the Obama administration. And it's an example of the circular economy idea. You do forest and watershed health projects, feed the residue into biomass facilities that could then create wood products, and heat or cool local community centers, as well as community resilience centers, areas where people know to go in the event of a fire. And those resilience centers can be used to train workers to go out into the forest. So, workforce is a massive problem right now. We have all these billions of dollars, but we don't have enough people trained as burn bosses or as professional foresters to go out and actually monitor a lot of these projects and programs. I just heard from the Washoe tribe earlier today as well that they have 10 people in their environmental program working on, an incredible amount of projects. One person alone manages the brownfields and invasive species projects together. So we really need more training and more opportunity to get more staff out into the world. And as we think about a just transition from oil and gas jobs, we have a perfect opportunity in front of us to transition to really proactive forest management that can produce these circular economies and benefit statewide. And then these are just a couple of other examples on the left here. You can see these resilience pillars that came out of the Tahoe Central Sierra Initiative. These are science-based resilience goals that if you accomplish forest restoration and forest resilience properly, these are the types of values that you'll be talking about. What are the types of things that you really want to focus on addressing and meeting as you think about forest resilience and forest management? And these are just examples. There are clearly many more, but these are ones that are being used in the Tahoe Basin. And this is another example of another project where you can kind of think about how you allocate funding around the state. Areas where there's low resilience and low collaborative capacity, you have to fund efforts to get a lot of collaboratives up and going. And areas where you have people who are great at making decisions and have projects ready to go, just fund the projects and keep them going. But we need to be very strategic about how we take these actions. So that's it. I tried to get through that quickly. I guess my main takeaways are really that, we have the money. We understand the need and we understand the solutions. What we need is will, courage, workforce, and collaborative capacity to get these projects out on the ground. And so that will take all of you. Thank you so much.
Great. Yeah, thank you for tying up everything in that last little bit. Definitely a lot of great information, and apologies to folks. We're kind of at time, but do want to pass to one more speaker who is going to share about a quick call to action. So Matt Holmes, and before you go, for people that did drop questions in the chat, I'm going to direct our panelists to feel free to share their contact info so you can get a hold of them directly to reach out about any of those questions. So Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Jasmine. I just want to be really brief to thank our panelists for, Dr. Irva laying out why this matters to everybody and how this hurts everybody. And of course, because it's America, it hurts people of color worse and low-income communities worse. So laying out that equity component to all of it. And for Dave, like showing us behind the scenes on how y'all fight these fires, and you know, giving people like us that aren't necessarily in forested communities an insight into how this is being addressed. And Ron, you know, obviously for laying out that this is the outcome. This is the most logical outcome of a cultural deficit that we have of treating the land as something that we always take something from. So, you know, thank you for your amazing leadership on that. I want to come volunteer on a burn someday. And I want, and then finally, you know, Ashley, for showing us that there's a way out of this. There are 33 million acres, but there are people that have been crunching on these issues. And the communities like ours, you know, we're all done hiding inside, you know, cowering under a mask for 3 months a year. And we have elected officials and they think they've got their priorities, but we really need to make this a statewide priority where communities like ours are part of solving this problem. You brought up workforce. Just because I'm not in the El Dorado National Forest doesn't mean I can't have a 30,000 square foot greenhouse growing drought resistant seedlings to reforest these burn scars with Dave's team and Ron's team after one of these fires, or by all means going in and helping with a burn and helping with that revegetation process. So I'm just really grateful for everybody. And there's a chance to make California do something about this. We have a giant plan called the carbon neutrality scoping plan. And California is putting a lot of money into a lot of, frankly, wild ideas, exploring really wild ideas. And what you heard about here today are proven ideas, scientifically based ideas and ecological and nature-based solutions that obviously stewards like Ron's people have been executing for millennia. There are ways for us to impact this scoping plan, and CVAQ has masterfully engineered an opportunity for the community to have its voice heard in that process. There is no official start date yet for communities being able to weigh in on this scoping plan, but that is imminent. And, you know, stay tuned to your CVAQ channel and we'll be getting the word out to everybody so that you can rattle your elected official by the collar and get them to support the types of investments that we need, because as we saw, these, you know, every dollar we spend here is going to save us a good 50 around the corner. So really appreciate everybody's expertise and helping, you know, this community find its way to have a voice in our forests. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. And thank you again to all of our speakers and all of our attendees. We really hope that we started a conversation today that can keep going, and reach out to either the panelists or CVAQ directly if you want to get more information on anything shared tonight. And also we will post and share the recording on our YouTube channel. So feel free to check that out as well. Have a good evening, everyone.